Hi, David Mould here. Thanks for joining us. If you're going to San Antonio, July 2nd to the 11th, this video is for you. And if you're not, I believe you'll still be blessed by watching it. Among the issues up for discussion in San Antonio, the election of the president of the General Conference. Based on a quick look at our Gleaner ad, you probably think that I dislike our current president, Elder Ted Wilson. I don't. I actually like him, but there are some things that have got to be discussed before that man is put back in office. That's why I believe the Lord impressed us to take out this ad, to force discussion, to compel discussion. There's no telling how far the spark kindled this morning might grow in the 3 weeks before this convention. That's why we've done it, in the hope that God will do for this ad what he did with Samson's foxes. You don't know that story? Let me tell you. Here it is in the Word of God. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between the two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. That's Judges 15, 4 and 5. How did James put it? Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindles. That's James 3, 5. How I would love to see this fire rage. How I'd love to see it sweeping over every delegate to this convention to the point where to a man or a woman they would acknowledge the things this man is saying are true. This convention cannot proceed until these issues are dealt with. That's my whole purpose, my goal in running the ad and preparing this video, to bring conviction to the delegates to the General Conference session in San Antonio. It's a tall order, and it's going to take prayer, fasting, and God himself to make these things happen. But I've done my part today. The fire is lit. Before we get into the issue that is driving me today, let me give you a quick overview of my relationship with Elder Wilson. For one, I knew him long before he was elected president in Atlanta in 2010. Here's the backdrop. I first met him in either 71 or 72 when I was working at a vegetarian restaurant in New York City called The Beautiful Way. Rick and Gwen Shorter ran it. They introduced me to him, they introduced me to Ron Halverson, but it was on the streets of New York that I met Ted Wilson. And then in the 1980s, I think that would have been the next time I saw Ted. And there's a fascinating story there. Our ministry, Jesus Behind Bars, was involved in prison ministry at the Federal Penitentiary for Women in Alderson, West Virginia. One day, the warden contacted me. She said, David, I have a problem. There was an inmate here who was caught peddling drugs, and she's from Nigeria, and she's going crazy, fretting about her twins. She doesn't know what the situation is with her children. Can you help me? And of course, I said to myself, who do I know in Nigeria? I don't know anybody in Nigeria, but as I told her I would see what we could do. Well, I contacted the General Conference, and as things turned out, we were able to get in touch with Ted Wilson. It's a long, rather convoluted story. I think I may have written him like 3-4 months earlier, and then out of the blue one day we got a phone call, and it was Ted Wilson. And he was kidding, saying, David, next time you write me, put a first-class stamp on it, because my letter had shown up like 3 months late. But he called at the right time. We were in the midst of this crisis. And I put the case to him and asked him if he could do anything for this inmate in the federal penitentiary. And he said he would try. Now, he wasn't in Nigeria. He was in the Ivory Coast, a neighboring country. But he dispatched, I believe it was the conference president in Lagos, who went to the address we gave him. And he was able to determine that the children were safe. So quick as a flash, it might have been a week or two, I don't know, but we got word back to the inmate through the warden that her children were fine. You would have thought I was God on earth. The reaction to lift that woman's burden, and it went through the prison like wildfire. That was the next time I had any sort of encounter with Ted. It would have been in the 1980s. After that, about maybe 10, 12 years passed. After 1996, when he was elected head of or president of the review, I went to visit him just to say hi. I might have been in Washington on some other errands and went to visit him. And we had a good time. I remember we sat down, and one of the quotes that I shared with him was from Colporteur Ministry, page 4, which he knew well, about the work, the last work being finished through our publishing houses. This is why it makes that statement, and we spoke about it. After that, maybe another 14 years passed, because it was June in 2010. I had another reason to go and visit him, this time up in Silver Spring, 10 days before he was elected president of the General Conference. I still have the name tag given to me that day. I'll tell you the reason why I went to see him, but I remember him standing outside his office. He introduced me to Mark Finley and still referred to me in connection with Jesus Behind Bars. Dr. Paul Brantley had an office, I think, right next door, and I saw him that day too. But what did we discuss? Essentially, there were 3 items. Jack Henderson and the Great Controversy. I'd never heard Jack Henderson's name before, but I'll come back to that. We also discussed the Shepherd Rods organization. And thirdly, money. In particular, a gift of $100 million that the church had relatively recently received. Those are the 3 things. Jack Henderson, he was the one who told me about Jack Henderson. You could see the excitement on his face. Jack had approached him with a project about distributing the Great Controversy via zip code, all the zip codes in the United States. And he was just excited. He had allowed Jack, or invited Jack, to come and conduct worship up at the General Conference. It had gone well, and he was speaking to me about how much he was getting behind the project, etc. But we also discussed the Shepherd Rod. Now, why, and I'll be honest with you, the Shepherd Rod organization is the reason, above all, why I had gone to see Ted Wilson that day. And I'll tell you how that came about. At a religious liberty dinner several months earlier, Lincoln Steed and I were talking, and Lincoln had mentioned to me that he was getting not necessarily a flood of email from the Davidians or the Shepherd Rod members, but he was hearing from 1 or 2 of them. And something sparked in my mind. I became alarmed because of an utterly fanatical teaching held by some members of that group. Years before that, maybe 20 years before or more, 25, I was preaching in New York at a church, and I think it was in Manhattan. And after the sermon, a gentleman came up to me and introduced himself to me as a Gileadite. I'd never heard that name before. And the Gileadites, it turns out, are part of the wing, or one of the wings of the Shepherd Rod organization. And he told me that he enjoyed my sermon, but that it didn't go far enough. And I questioned him, what did he mean? The man says he was an angel, and he would be killing Seventh-day Adventist pastors before the return of the Lord. Yes, that's what he said. He would be killing. What it was a twisted interpretation of Ezekiel 9. My eyes must have been bulging out of my head. I couldn't believe that I was hearing what I was hearing from a sane person. But the Davidians have this teaching about Ezekiel 9. And some of them may take it further than others. Maybe they aren't all Gileadites. I don't know. But it was enough to me to hear that kind of fanaticism. And with the General Conference session coming up in Atlanta, where all the leaders of the church would be gathered under one roof, I became alarmed at what Lincoln Steed shared with me. Worse yet, about a week or 2 prior to that, at our own church, we had discovered one of the Davidians, or a Shepherd Rod lady, on our choir. And you need to know that the teaching is not the teaching of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Not at all. And when asked about this slaughter, she said she would participate in it. That it would be an unwelcome thing or a gruesome thing, but she would do it if God called upon her to do it. So I said to myself, what in the world? What is this? And so there they are contacting Lincoln. And I said, Lincoln, you know, you really should go to your superiors, your bosses, and tell them about this uptick in traffic coming from the Davidians. And he said he would, but he didn't. And after a couple months of Lincoln's silence, and I'm watching the date coming for the General Conference session in Atlanta, I decided, you know something? I'm going to call Ted Wilson myself. And I called him. And I told him I wanted to see him. He was surprised. Of course, he remembered me. He said, come. And I got the appointment with him and went to Silver Spring. It turns out that Ted Wilson knew nothing about that diabolical doctrine, that twisted interpretation of Ezekiel 9, where they think they're going to be the ones carrying out this slaughter of Seventh-day Adventist pastors. But Ted Wilson did tell me this. He said I'd come to the right place. that he was in charge of security, not only at the building in Silver Spring, but that he'd be in charge of security at the Georgia Dome. Now, I know that in saying what I'm saying to you now, I have not endeared myself to the shepherd rod. As a matter of fact, I heard from Australia several months ago where somebody, one of our donors down there, told me she's having a hard time with the shepherd rod because they are saying a lot of evil things about me. Friend, I've read stuff about myself where I don't even recognize myself. So it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that Satan would stoop to slander. Paying the price with slander is a small price. If I can alert Seventh-day Adventists to the absolute danger this fanatical organization is to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. All right? This is still God's church. I may be a dissident, but I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. There is no eighth church. The Bible stops with 7, Laodicea. Okay? We also discussed briefly this gift of $100 million. I asked Ted Wilson, I said, Ted, I've just read, or, somebody in the grapevine tipped me off about somebody who had given the church one person's tithe. And I found out later it wasn't quite 100 million, so I'm assuming it was in the 90s. And by the way, for those of you watching from Jamaica, that's 10 billion Jamaican dollars. One man's tithe, okay? Yes, there are very wealthy people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I remember Charles Bradford one year was preaching at the Mount Sinai Church, and he told a story about some Seventh-day Adventists who had found oil, and he had to send to Japan to get the cap the well. There was nothing in this country that could do it. Bradford said it at Mount Sinai. I heard him. So yes, the church has its billionaires, okay? And one of them apparently wrote a check for $100 million in tithe, okay? And I asked Ted, what happened to all that money? As a layman, I just wanted to know, what was the church doing with that? I hadn't heard of any raises being given to our teachers or pastors. I don't know of any of the third world pastors who were given automobile loans, for example, to get them off a bicycle so they could have more access to our church. What happened to that money? The first thing he did was turn slightly red. He may not know it, but I noticed it. Okay? And he said the money had gone to the divisions. Now, I didn't question him, but if I know my church, that means it was stashed away and it would never see the light of day. It would go into some stock fund, some stock portfolio. That's what that answer meant. All right? The church wasn't supposed to know about it. I wasn't supposed to know about it, but I did. I thank God for the Adventist grapevine. And I had confirmed it before speaking to him about it. 10 days later, he's elected president at the General Conference in Atlanta. To me, it was a breath of fresh air. The announcement about pushing the great controversy across the North American division and the world were music to my ears. Sometime after his election, though, it became clear that he had switched to this book, The Great Hope, which I'd never heard of before, but which the church now called the sharing edition of The Great Controversy. I'll put that particular edition on the screen so you can look at it. I was stunned at the switch in books. Plastering the name sharing edition of The Great Controversy over this thing doesn't make it The Great Controversy. All the essentials in The Great Controversy, and I'm holding in my hands the New Illustrated Great Controversy. As a matter of fact, I have one here, which you'll see. This is what it's going to look like, our new revised version of the New Illustrated Great Controversy. This is more or less the size that we're coming out with, okay? With some spreads, some real beautiful spreads in there. All the essentials in the Great Controversy have been stripped out. And it's stripped out of the Great Controversy, and then the name plastered over this. It's stripped, it's ripped, it's just gone. The prophecies about the beast, his image and his mark are gone. Sunday laws are gone. In the last report that I saw, the brethren reported, I think it was over 160 million copies of the Great Controversy. That's what they said were distributed. But when you check the fine print in some divisions, like the South American division, it's all the Great Hope. What I want to know is this. How many millions of dollars were raised from trusting, loyal Seventh-day Adventists who thought they were sponsoring the Great Controversy? How many lawsuits have been filed from members who feel absolutely robbed, cheated, and disgusted with the leadership of this church? The church will never tell you Beloved, we can't go into the general conference session with this sort of stuff just dangling out there. Some of you watching this already know that every word I've just said is true. I'd go as far as to say I'm sure 3ABN knows about it, but they won't touch it. I'm sure the Hope Channel knows about it, but they won't touch it. There are a whole bunch of people who know about it, but for one reason or another, they won't touch it. Maybe it will mean their popularity or their jobs. I don't know. It was Jesus who said, "How can you believe which receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only?" That's John 5:44. That's what it boiled down to in this church. Who cares for God anymore? It's you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Which is why God has had to raise up independent ministries such as ourselves to bring issues like these before you. Silence? No. Pretending we didn't know these things makes us all a party to a magnificent general conference fraud. You know, I was watching YouTube the other night and I came across a song, "Blowing in the Wind." It's actually written by Bob Dylan.
How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see?
How many times? How many times must a man turn his head, pretending he just doesn't see? I can't turn my head. I'm not wired that way. Can't do it. In spite of everything I've just said, I do not believe the great hope is Ted Wilson's idea. I do not believe that this man was lying to me when he spoke with such enthusiasm about Jack Henderson and his great controversy project. I do not believe he was faking it when almost immediately after being elected, he sent for Jack Henderson to address the General Conference session in Atlanta. Under Elder Paulson's leadership, Brother Henderson couldn't even get a booth at the General Conference. But the moment Ted Wilson was elected, he arranged for Jack Henderson to address the World Church. That was some booth. That was the first inkling I had of a gigantic tug-of-war going on behind the scenes at the top of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. While some in church leadership were for the great controversy, others were clearly dead set against it. But let me continue. I do not believe Ted Wilson was being hypocritical when, and I believe it was during his first year of office, he appealed to the workers of the General Conference for funds to mail the great controversy to every home in the General Conference's own zip code there in Silver Spring. He needed less than 30,000, and he raised closer to 60,000 from enthusiastic workers. But have those books been shipped? Listen to me. I checked last night. They still have not been shipped. That's been 4 years. Let me ask again. Have they been shipped? No. Not even the General Conference president can get the great controversy shipped as he wants. I'm telling you, something stinks to high heaven at the top of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And you know what? I believe most of you watching this smell it. You see it, and you know that every word I'm saying is true. To my mind, these are issues that absolutely need to be resolved before that man ever sets foot back in office. As Elder Wilson said to me during our meeting, "Brother Mould, I'm not happy with everything in the church, but there is no king at the General Conference. This church is run by committee." Well, as I said on one of our videos, I don't know what gun is being pointed at his head. But this is not the Ted Wilson I know. This Ted Wilson who has switched books is not the Ted Wilson I know. I know the man loves the great controversy. This is not the Ted Wilson who sat with me and poured out his heart about the great controversy. This Ted Wilson is a puppet doing somebody else's bidding. And I'd like to know who, and I'd like to know why. I believe Elder Wilson probably thinks that if he shares what's really going on with the great controversy, if he tells the world church why he really switched from the great controversy to the great hope, or more specifically, what pressure was brought to bear upon him that compelled him to switch books, if he shares these things with the rank and file members of the church, We just might wake up and realize that many of our committees are in fact controlled by people who hate this church and who hate its message. Personally, I believe many of the so-called brethren are in fact agents of the Roman Catholic Church. Agents who would like to do to us what they probably orchestrated at the Worldwide Church of God. If they had their way, they'd wipe the entire Seventh-day Adventist Church off the map. Have we forgotten? Have we forgotten what Mrs. White's inspired pen had to say about the Jesuits? I don't have time to go into much Jesuit history now. I've already done it in our videos. But it would do us well to remember these lines. And this is from The Great Controversy. When appearing as members of their order, they wore a garb of sanctity, visiting prisons and hospitals, ministering to the sick and the poor, professing to have renounced the world and bearing the sacred name of Jesus, who went about doing good. But under this blameless exterior, the most criminal and deadly purposes were often concealed. It was a fundamental principle of the order that the end justifies the means. By this code, lying, theft, perjury, assassination were not only pardonable, but commendable when they served the interests of the church. Under various disguises, the Jesuits worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings and shaping the policy of nations. That's from page 235 of this book, The New Illustrated Great Controversy. With this sort of track record behind them, do you honestly think they would have ignored the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Do you think they would have ignored the Seventh-day Adventist Church with a book like The Great Controversy that not only exposes the history of the Roman Catholic Church, but that exposes them? I really don't know how far I should go today because I'd like to keep this appeal focused. But if you want to know more about the Jesuits, then I'd strongly suggest you go to the video, Should Ted Wilson Be Impeached? Part 3, The Jesuits. But let me get back to Elder Wilson. I believe Elder Wilson knows that if he opens his mouth, it could start a war. If he opens his mouth, it just might split this entire church, and he wouldn't want to be the one responsible for that. He wouldn't want that on his watch. But the longer he keeps quiet about the real reason for the switch in books, which involves so many millions of dollars, the more he looks like a crook. A crook who knew what he was doing when he raised those millions of dollars and then turn around and have them funneled to this piece of trash, this piece of treason known across the world as the Great Hope. You know the tragedy of all of this, as disappointed as I am with Elder Wilson's actions, I don't know if anyone else would or could do anything better. That's how hamstrung, I believe, any elected official would be to the compromised committees behind the scenes that are truly running this church. I've tried to state these things in the videos at our website, beginning with Should Ted Wilson Be Impeached? Parts 1 to 3. Our production manager died before we could finish this series, so we started all over again with Adventist Crime Scenes, Parts 1 to 6. They're there for you to watch. We've followed these videos up with This Isn't Your Grandmother's Great Controversy. That's a reference to the book I'll put up on your screen. Charlie Hebdo and the Pope's visit to Congress and defending God's prophet. They're all there. But if you have limited time and can only watch a few before San Antonio, try Should Ted Wilson Be Impeached? And Adventist Crime Scenes. I've put them first in the queue at our website. I really don't know what else to say this morning, but I don't want to close without expressing my gratitude to the Jamaica Gleaner. Thank God for freedom of the press, and thank God for the Gleaner for allowing us to run this ad. If nothing else, it got you to our website. Because of what is in this ad about the Roman Catholic Church, because we've resurrected chapters of Roman Catholic bloodlust that many didn't know existed, because this ad has probably already opened thousands of eyes in its first reading and will probably open thousands more as it is read again and again, I can imagine Roman Catholic pastor Richard Holong must be furious at us for designing it. and even more furious at the Gleaner for running it. So you can understand my gratitude for freedom of the press in my homeland, Jamaica. In the States, already efforts are being made to shut the press up. This is no joke. For example, in the last week of May, it was announced that you can't run any more religious or political ads on the Washington Metro. Personally, I think that ought to be challenged legally and overthrown, but that's another story. One more thing before I go. You see this subject of women's ordination. I told you I had two issues I want to discuss. One had to do with the Great Hope. Well, this other one is women's ordination. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But you see it? That's occupying so much of the church's time. I believe it is a red herring inserted into the dialogue of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to divert attention away from the main issue, which is the advances of the Roman Catholic Church across our planet. And for those of you who think those advances are mostly harmless, that the Roman Catholic Church has changed. I remember Roman Hegstead preaching that nonsense at the Altamont Springs Church maybe 25, 30 years ago. That the church, if they have changed, they've become more subtle, more cunning. But for those of you who think that the church has changed, go back and study your history. Look again at the Holocaust. Look again at the rat lines. These are the escape routes organized by Vatican agents for some 20,000 Nazis whom they helped to flee Europe and in some cases to flee certain death sentences for their activities in death camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Sobibor, Mauthausen, Belzec, and Treblinka. According to formerly top-secret files released by the Argentinian government in 1992, some of which I had the privilege of handling right there in Buenos Aires, it was the Roman Catholic Church that assisted these butchers to gain false identities and false passports, and then to end up in the safe Catholic regime of Juan and Evita Perón in Argentina. Of course, from there, many of them went to other countries in South America. But back to the source, Adolf Hitler. Who in God's name do you think brought Adolf Hitler to power? Whose bidding do you think he was doing? Thank God for Professor John Cornwell for bringing this before the world. Pope Pius XII, before he was pious, was the one who orchestrated Hitler's rise to power. Of course, they vilified Cornwell and tried to say all manner of evil about him. But the man got his information from the Vatican archives. He went there and applied for permission as a good Catholic wanting to exonerate the Pope, and they turned over the archives. And he got access to records which the public would never see, would never otherwise have known. And he wrote the book, Hitler's Pope, indicting the Roman Catholic Church for much of the, well, let's put it this way, certainly for Hitler's rise to power. It took the release of those files in Argentina for me to start connecting the dots. But the bottom line, what I'm saying is, instead of focusing on women's ordination, which I hope never sees the light of day, I'm reminded of this statement from Professor Samuel Morse in his book, Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. He said this: "We are busying ourselves in quenching the few falling sparks that threaten the deck of the ship, without heeding the fire beneath that is approaching the magazine." And by magazine, he's referring not to something you read, but to the stores of gunpowder on board. That's what Satan has us as a church doing, focusing on the sparks falling on the deck, focusing on women's ordination and other items from what I call the Great Adventist Trivia Game, instead of on the advances of the Roman Catholic Church across our planet. If we wait until that magazine explodes in our faces, it's going to be too late. You see the Pope scheduled to address Congress on September 24th. What is he going to say? He's been saying much about the limits to free speech and will probably reiterate these sentiments when he comes. Do you really want to live in a world where you couldn't say a word against the papacy or any faith? Do you really want to live in a world where if you say anything against the policies or the record of any faith group, you would be arrested? Do you want to live in that world? Well, if the Pope has his way, it's coming. What in God's name is the General Conference doing in anticipation of this speech on September 24th? What plans does the Seventh-day Adventist Church have to counter it? Beloved, ask yourself a question. When does silence transcend cowardice and become treason. Are there any Protestants left in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? As for me, don't you think I know that opening my mouth the way I'm doing it today could get me killed? Of course I know it. Why then open my mouth at all? Because I'd rather be dead than silent. I'd rather be dead than live in a world where I have to turn my head and pretend, as Bob Dylan said, that I just don't see. I see millions scammed from faithful Seventh-day Adventists, and I am opening my mouth, and you won't shut me up. It was Jesus who said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whosoever will lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it. For what is a man advantaged if he gain the whole world and lose himself or be cast away? For whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words, of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed, when he shall come in his own glory and in his Father's and of the holy angels. Luke 9:23-26. Let me share one quote with you before I close. It's from this book, The Great Controversy, page 566. Protestants have tampered with and patronized popery. They have made compromises and concessions which papists themselves are surprised to see and fail to understand. Men are closing their eyes to the real character of Romanism and the dangers to be apprehended from her supremacy. The people, if you haven't heard me say anything else today, remember this sentence. The people need to be aroused to resist the advances of this most dangerous foe to civil and religious liberty. I take that seriously. I'm to do my part to arouse the masses to resist the advances of the Roman Catholic Church. How do we arouse America? Same way we aroused you, the press. I know we can arouse America to resist Roman Catholicism. I absolutely know this. We've got an ad infinitely more powerful than the one that led you to this video. An ad that will clear every legal challenge raised by those who will definitely not want to see it run. Beyond this ad places a moral imperative on the media itself to run it. But it's going to cost a ton of money to get it into the Wall Street Journal or USA Today. Minimum $250,000. Here, I'll put USA Today's rate sheet on the screen for you. Do you see that? One full-page ad on a Friday will cost $242,600. Who loves America enough to spend that kind of money to stir the nation? Somebody out there watching this has the funds. I know that. God wouldn't have me saying these things to an empty audience. He said, my word will not return unto me void. Somebody out there has it. Several of you have it. Maybe you who had your well gushing oil where you had to send to Japan to cap it. Maybe you're listening to this. I don't know who's watching this. This is the internet. If the Lord moves me to go public with our ad, to share it on the internet, I will do so. For now, though, let's see if this Gleaner ad goes anywhere. Let's see if God gives it wings. Let's see if we can get the church in session in San Antonio to vote to refund to every Seventh-day Adventist who feels absolutely cheated. And there are many of them. Every last dime of the millions of dollars fraudulently diverted from the great controversy to promote this piece of trash. That act of fraud, in Jamaica we would call it generalship. That act of fraud is one stain upon the church's honor that ought to be removed and can be removed. Collectively, you and I can make this happen. I know this. My role has been to open my mouth, to bark as a watchdog, to get the issue out there, to draw publicity to this scam, which is what it was or is. Your role, if you're a delegate, is to caucus with other delegates and to make sure this item, and I'm talking about refunds for those who were defrauded, make sure this item makes it onto the agenda for full-blown discussion. If God could stop the rain in answer to the prayers of 50-something pastors over in Trinidad, and I'll get to that in a moment, then he can stop the Jesuits too. He will do wonders when his people caucus together and pray. You know something? Perhaps the best thing I could do right now before I sign off with a personal note to Ted Wilson is to let you hear a testimony the likes of which I'd never heard before. It's coming from Pastor Earl Cleveland, the former chairman of the board of Jesus Behind Bars, our first ministry. For those of you who are delegates to this upcoming convention and who think that you are so small and the machinery of this behemoth, this Seventh-day Adventist church is just too big, just too powerful for you to do anything to stop it, listen to how God stopped rain.
Trinidad is a multicultural country where all races have just melted and enmeshed through the years, and religion down there is largely Hindu and Catholic and Protestant and spiritualistic. I landed there not knowing very much about the place. I was sent there by my organization. Little would I know the blessings that awaited me there. They sent me there in the rainy season, and I had 2 big tents and benches in between the tents, and we were anticipating great crowds, but every day it rained. Let's start with that, which meant that coming out to tent meetings in the rain was not anything that the inhabitants of Trinidad anticipated or ever really did. But there were 58 preachers from 13 countries that were sent to that island nation for me to train. And I was supposed to have training classes during the day, and we'd have public meetings during the night, and planning sessions in connection with the training sessions. It being the rainy season, the likelihood that anybody would come to those meetings was a matter of fact. Rain, they stayed in. So I took those 58 men and we said, look, God made the rain. Why can't we put him on a schedule? Why won't we ask the Lord to let it rain up until 5 o'clock in the afternoon? Because it was monsoon-type rains down there, not like the stuff that falls here. And the rains just wash out whatever is out there. So we got on our knees and prayed, Lord, tonight, let the rain stop at 5 o'clock. And don't let it start again until 11:30 at night. Now that was the prayer we prayed. All 58 of us had prayer that the Lord would put that rain on a schedule and organize it so we could get the meeting in. I've got news for you. For the next 9 weeks, the rain would stop between 4:30 and 5 o'clock, and the sun would come out and shine brightly and dry up the tent and everything. The grounds were dried up, and the people had plenty of time to get to the meetings, and I had plenty of time to preach the gospel and give the benediction. And in 1 hour after I turned out the lights, the rains would come. Every day, God kept that schedule for us. Now, that is kind of frightening. It seems like at least one meeting would have been run, because everything else was being rained out. It seemed that one meeting, but in the middle of the series of meetings, of course, we had to keep the Sabbath. This is during the day, the morning sessions, when the rains poured down the fastest and the greatest. We shifted our prayer. We said, now, Lord, we've got to do what we do back in the States. We don't have any other pattern. We have 11 o'clock services in the morning. We have Sabbath school in the morning. Let it rain all night, Friday night. Let the sun come out at the breaking of the day and dry everything out. And at 9:30, when we are supposed to start Sabbath school, have the people pouring in there in numbers that would stagger our imaginations. Now look at what we're doing now. We're asking the Lord not only to keep that thing blocked out in our night meetings, but we're saying now, when it starts on Friday night, let it rain all night. That's enough rain for the people, for the vegetation to grow, for the farmers to prosper. But well before 9:30 a.m., let the sun dry everything out, and Lord, give us a full house and thousands of people to come. Oh, by the way, on opening night, there were 8,000 people on those grounds. I said 8,000. The first Sabbath morning, about sunrise, there was sunshine. Dried out the tent, dried out the ground, and we had 4,000 people on those grounds for my Sabbath morning services. Now, I got to bring them back Sabbath afternoon at 5 o'clock, okay? I said, now, Lord, you know our doctrinal setup. I've got to have them this afternoon to teach them clean living and dietary improvements and a whole lot of other things. Let the rain stop like you do every day, and don't let it rain again until 11 o'clock. And keep that schedule for us. I want you to know that for 9 weeks, that cycle was not broken. On our first baptism day, the Lord held the rain up all day. We had 20 preachers baptizing 2 on 1 for 6 hours for the first baptism. No rain until the night when there was no service. Now, these miracles took place during that meeting. There were 1,217 people baptized in that meeting. There was a brand new church put up on the hillside, and they named it Cleveland Temple. And it's still standing there, and the word I get is it's still full of people. But these miracles I could not account for except Jehovah was with me. But the most outstanding thing happened on the first Sabbath we met. The mayor of the city, who was not of my faith, decided that he was going to send a bulldozer out there and disrupt the services. So I was still up at the Queen's Park Hotel when word came that there was a bulldozer, that they cannot understand the Sabbath school lesson or anything else, and there's a man out there that nobody can stop. He's just doing this. So I got dressed early and slipped down there, and we decided to have a little prayer on the brother and the bulldozer, since nobody could control him, and he was authorized to come down there and disturb the service. Well, bless your heart, while we were praying, The motor exploded. I said the motor exploded. The last we saw of the brother, he was scaling the fence and leaving the lot as fast as he could. And that thing stood there all day, a silent witness to the power of God. Well, stories like this strengthen me to know that Jehovah is at work in public evangelistic ministry as well as in person to person.
Now you delegates, stop your quaking and go pray. Pray to Jehovah God for a breakthrough. Pray till your knees hurt. Pray till you're tired. Pray till you're weak. Pray till you drop, that this madness in the church will cease. Now let me leave with a personal note to Ted Wilson. Brother Ted, you might have been scared out of your wits when you went against your own conscience and switched books. Agents of the papacy might have had a gun to your head. I don't know what they were threatening to do to you, but what you did was fraud. You don't use your office as president of the General Conference to raise all that money and then divert it, even if a committee says to divert it, to an utterly castrated version of the great controversy. I don't believe the name Antichrist is mentioned once in this book, if you can call it a book. You know, and I know, and most people who have read the great controversy know, there is no portion of this watered-down, castrated piece of trash that deserves the title, the great controversy. You might see me as your enemy this morning for being so plain. A dyed-in-the-wool enemy for being as forthright as I'm being today. But I'm not your enemy. I'm really not. When I think of Ted Wilson, I tell you, the fondest memories I have of you all revolve around how God used you to find that inmate's children in Nigeria. I'll never forget it. I'll remember it with tears in my eyes, in my heart, as long as I live. But let me close. Let me leave you, Brother Ted, and all of you watching this with one verse of Scripture. It's Proverbs 27:16. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. He who hath ears to hear, let him hear.